Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're just going to give a couple minutes to let folks trickle in, and then we will get started. Welcome, everyone that's joining. We're just giving it a couple minutes so folks can log on, and then we'll get started. I- One more minute extra. Thank you all this morning. We're excited to share all of this wonderful information with you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome and good morning, everyone, to JBAY's Completing the FAFSA CADAA webinar for adults supporting youth with experience in foster care or homelessness. We've got a lot of information to cover today, so thank you for joining us. For those of you that are not familiar with us, we are John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we work to improve the quality of life for youth in California who have either been in foster care or homeless by advocating for better laws, training our communities to strengthen local practices, and conducting research to inform policy solutions. And we do this work in 3 different areas, including education, housing, and economic mobility. Just a few housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting this online at jbay.org after this webinar. Attendees may turn on or disable closed captioning. If at any point during the webinar you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A section. We've got some amazing subject matter experts that I'll introduce shortly, but again, if you have any questions, please use that feature. And then slides will be emailed following this webinar. So to introduce myself, my name is Cody Van Felden. I am the Senior Project Associate here at John Burton Advocates for Youth, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to my co-presenter to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. Chris Jenny, he, him, his pronouns. Senior Project Manager here on the education team based in LA County for John Burton's Advocates for Youth.
Thank you, Chris. And as mentioned, we've got some amazing subject matter experts. So we have Mark Kansowitz and David Levy, who are truly experts on many things financial aid and have been an incredible resource for us here at JBAY. We then have Jillian Sitar and Caleb McKay from Schoolhouse Connection. And last but not least, we have our own Director of Education, Jessica Petres, who will be answering all of your questions, whether that's technical, if it's situational. These are going to be the folks that will answer all your questions throughout the webinar. All right, so as I said, we have a full agenda today. So we're going to start off by talking about why financial aid matters and why this process is so important for our students who are experiencing the foster care system or homelessness. Then I know many of you are anxious to hear about what's new, not just for the FAFSA or CADAA application, but also on a federal level. So we'll be sharing some updates. Then we'll be going over how to apply, what happens after a student applies, and providing you with many resources to help you support your students?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cody. So to start us off, we're going to talk today about why financial aid matters. Okay, so to ground our conversation, it's really important to highlight the barriers that foster and homeless youth do face. And so a few of them you can actually see here. And so this can be lack of parental familiar support, lack of stable living environment, trauma experiences, increasing skepticism about the value of higher education, and then limited academic prep, and then accessing financial aid. And so these barriers here, they're not about ability, they're ultimately about access. And so many in foster and homeless students are incredibly resilient, but they're navigating college without the safety net that most students do take for granted. And that's why financial aid and trauma-informed support matter so much. They're not just extras, they're ultimately about what make it possible for students to succeed. And so, as you can see here, for financial aid truly does make a difference. And as we said, finances can be a real barrier. So we know that accessing financial aid makes a significant difference in a student's success in college, which is why it's so critical that students get support in successfully filling out these applications. And so, for example, research has found that high school seniors who complete the FAFSA are 84% more likely to enroll in college directly after high school. 49% of students that received at least 7,500 in financial aid transferred or graduated. But in comparison, only 17% of students receiving 1,000 to 2,500 transferred or graduated. And then lastly, youth who received the Chafee Grant in California were twice as likely to complete a degree, and this is according to Cal Youth. So what we can really see here is that the more financial aid, the greater the opportunity and the greater the prospects. EOP or Next Up grant. So you can see the variety that exists here, right? And it's important to know this that these grants stack. So it's not one or the other, and that's like especially the case for foster youth. And in addition, many students who have will actually have access to a CalKIDS scholarship, which typically provides an additional 500 to 1,000. So that's not listed here, but we will be talking more about CalKIDS scholarship today. And again, what's powerful is that these are not loans. This is real aid, meaning students can focus on their education instead of juggling multiple jobs just to stay enrolled. And as you can see, there are less resources that are available for non-foster youth. So we want to point that out. But clearly, there still is a great amount of help as well. And while today we won't describe all the different types of federal and state aid in today's training, this slide at least does give you a snapshot. Now, as we know, money isn't the only barrier that foster and homeless youth face. They do need support. And so doing a FAFSA or CADAA creates an opportunity for a broader discussion that is about a youth's future plans and then the benefits of post-secondary education. And based on focus groups and feedback, nothing beats one-on-one support that a youth receives. So we really want to know just how important your support is in helping youth. And often students are referred to FAFSA workshops where their specific needs are not necessarily addressed, or to meet with counselors who may not understand the nuances of completing a FAFSA or a CADA for the foster youth population or for homeless students. And so while providing individualized one-on-one support to each student who is in foster care or who is experiencing homelessness, as you know, we know it does have a tremendous payoff, but we also acknowledge that it does take a lot of time. But the payoff ultimately for successfully completing the financial aid process is enormous. So we really encourage you, regardless of what context you're working in, to please make this a priority over the next several months.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. So let's go ahead and dive into what's new. So, unlike in previous years, the FAFSA and CADA opened on time this year. And in fact, it actually opened a few days in advance of October 1st. So, we are really encouraging students and families to start that application process early so there's time to resolve any issues before those priority deadlines. And then, as we'll talk about shortly, the first step in the application process is creating a federal student aid identification account, or an FSA ID, in order for students to verify their identity and be able to electronically sign their application. And we've got some great news. Identity verification for FSA IDs is now automatically processed, unlike in prior years where it could take several days to process. So, this means for our students, there will be fewer delays and fewer students getting stuck waiting for verification to be completed. Now, in relation to the FAFSA application, not the CADAA application, the gender question has been replaced with the question about the student's sex. Now, this change aligns with federal reporting requirements, but it does not affect eligibility for financial aid. But we will talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. And then the CADA remains available for mixed status families and undocumented students. So make sure families know which application to complete based on citizenship and residency status. And again, we will also talk a little bit more about this in detail shortly. Now, as many of you know, Congress recently has passed this so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, which includes significant cuts to federal programs. So on the higher education side, the impact was less severe than we expected, but it still is concerning. Most of the changes affect federal student loans, including reconstructing of income-driven repayment plans, which will make repayment more expensive for many borrowers. Then we've got the new federal loan caps, which you can see on the slide, and this may push more students toward higher cost private loans. And then lastly, the elimination of economic hardship and unemployment deferments for borrowers who take out loans on or after July 1st, 2027. So this means that it's more important than ever for students to maximize the amount of grant aid that they receive and avoid taking out loans. By following all the steps that we're going to be outlining in this webinar, not only completing the FAFSA or CADA application, but also the steps that take place after the applications are submitted, you can really help students avoid taking out loans. And now the most notable addition is the creation of short-term Pell Grants, and this is also known as Workforce Pell, for students enrolled in a credential program lasting 8 to 15 weeks. However, how beneficial this change will be remains to be seen. This really is dependent on its implementation details. So please stay tuned from updates from JBAY. We will be sending out updates as this program begins to roll out over the next year. And all of these changes do take effect July 1st, 2026, unless otherwise noted. Now, with students with experience in foster care may qualify for additional financial aid through the Chafee Grant, and this is also known as the Chafee Education and Training Voucher. Now, while federal limits have not changed, in California, the Chafee Grant maximum award has been reduced from $5,000 to $4,500 per year. This adjustment will allow more students to receive funding who might otherwise be placed on a wait list. So this is great news for a lot more students to be able to receive this really critical funding to help them finish out their educational journeys. And then additionally, while there have been attempts at the federal level to disallow undocumented students from receiving the Chafee Grant, in California, the use of state funding to supplement federal funds means that the Chafee Grant remains open to eligible undocumented students who complete a California DREAM Act application. So this is also great news for our students in California. And then just wanted to share some reminders for this webinar. So we are focusing on independent single students. Now, if you don't know how independent is defined for FAFSA purposes, we will be covering this later. So students who are considered dependent will need to provide information about their parents. We are not covering that in this webinar. And then with married students, they will need to provide spousal income information. This is something we will also not be covering in this webinar. Now, this webinar does not cover every step of the application completion process, just some of the highlights. But at the end, we will share about other resources that we are making available that provide a comprehensive overview of all the steps, as well as general FAFSA and CADAA completion resources that can be used for those students who are not independent. And of course, this webinar is relevant to the current 26-27 FAFSA, and the information could change in future years.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in and then talk about how to apply. Okay, so this is sort of your the beginning of your choose your own adventure. So the first step in the application process is to determine which form to complete. So both forms open the door to grants that don't have to be paid back. And completing one of these applications is the single biggest step towards making college affordable. And so the FAFSA is for US citizens, permanent residents, or other eligible non-citizens. The FAFSA can be completed online at fafsa.gov, and the website is mobile friendly and available in both English and in Spanish. Now, although the application is called for federal student aid, the application is used to apply for both federal and state financial aid. So those who don't qualify to submit a FAFSA because of immigration status may be eligible to complete the California DREAM Act application, or CADAA. And this is available to undocumented students who meet certain eligibility criteria, such as attending California schools for a minimum period of time. The CADAA is also available to certain categories of visa holders who cannot submit a FAFSA, such as those with temporary protected status or a U visa. Detailed information about who qualifies is available on the CADAA website. Now, a couple other things too. The CADA can also be submitted by students who qualify to submit a FAFSA, but who have a spouse or parent who is undocumented and they're concerned about providing this information to the federal government. These households are sometimes referred to as mixed status households. And so note that an otherwise eligible student who chooses to forego submitting a FAFSA and submits a CADA instead will be considered for state aid only. Now, the online application is only available in English, although you may be able to use your browser's translation options to read the application in a different language. A paper version of both the FAFSA and CADA are also available, but it is not recommended that students use the paper application unless, in the case of the CADA, the student needs a Spanish language version. And the reason why is simply that submitting online helps to reduce errors. So we just want to be mindful of that. And so for those of you who work with foster youth who are undocumented, they may have a pending application for residency through the Special Immigration Juvenile Status Program. And if so, they are not eligible for federal financial aid and then should submit the CADA until they have received permanent residence status. And then lastly, when working with undocumented students, they may be hesitant to disclose their status as undocumented on a state application. And you can let them know that it would be very difficult for the federal government to gain access to this information and that California is committed to protecting their confidentiality. At the same time, we recognize that each individual must weigh the risk and the benefits and then make their own choice. So CSAC's privacy memo, which details the steps being taken to protect students' information that is available at the link shown on this slide. Okay. So how is eligibility determined? So basically, schools look at your total cost to attend college and then subtract what your application shows you can contribute. And that's how they figure out your eligibility for need-based aid like Cal Grant or Pell. So colleges and universities first determine the cost of attendance, which is the total amount it costs to attend college. And this can include tuition, housing, meals, books, transportation, all that jazz. Now, each institution then determines this amount for their college and based on whether the student is living on campus, off campus, or with their parents. Next, the FAFSA and CADA both ask a series of questions to determine a student's Student Aid Index, or SAI. So it's generally based on the student's income, assets, and then household size. The lower the number, the more aid the student is eligible for. And so the SAI can go as low as a negative 1,500. And the student's SAI is then subtracted from the cost of attendance to determine their eligibility for need-based aid, such as Cal Grant and Pell Grant. A student cannot receive aid that exceeds their total cost of attendance. And a reminder, the Chafee Grant, which is a grant for foster youth that we'll be talking more about later, is excluded from the calculation of eligibility for unmet need. And this means that even if the total of other aid meets or exceeds the cost of attendance, students can still receive a Chafee grant above and beyond the cost of attendance. Okay, something important to remember, these dates. So March 2nd, 2026 is the deadline to submit for those who are attending a four-year university. September 2nd, 2026 is the deadline to submit for those attending a California community college. So these dates are really important because they determine whether a student qualifies for state aid like the Cal Grant. If the student isn't sure whether they're going to attend a California community college or a four-year university, they should apply by the earlier deadline. And if a student misses the deadline, they should still apply as they can still get federal aid like the Pell Grant. But meeting these priority deadlines does give the student access to the most money possible. Now, in addition, some sources of aid, like the Chafee Grant, consider when a student applies as part of the prioritization for access. So the earlier a student submits, the better. Getting information about the aid that is available early can also help students decide where to attend and then serve as a kind of a motivator for students to complete the various other steps necessary to successfully enroll. Last to note, private or out-of-state colleges, they may have earlier priority deadlines, and so students should really check with those campuses to see, so that way that they can understand and are considering that in their application, and then know about their deadlines as well.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive in on the steps before the FAFSA or CADAA application. So as mentioned earlier, before beginning the FAFSA, students must create an FSA ID. Now this process uses the student's name, date of birth, and social security number to verify their identity. So your student would go to FAFSA.gov and follow the directions to create a new account, or they would use the launch page that's shown on the slide. They would enter their email address and their social security number, and again, both of these are required to complete this FSA ID. And then they can also include a mobile phone number. This isn't required, but it is recommended. And then they would enter their name exactly as it appears on their social security card. Now, as mentioned earlier as well, FSA IDs are now created immediately, allowing students to begin the FAFSA right away. So students will be asked for that username and password that they created, and they should create a safe system to store their username and password. They must provide an email address and have the option to provide a phone number. Providing that phone number is recommended because it does make it easier if the student needs to reset their password. And if a student already has created an FSA ID previously, they will need to verify their email address and their phone number. And then make sure students do not use their high school email addresses, which may not be available to them after they graduate. But if necessary, you can help the student to set up a Gmail or a similar account so they can use this for college applications. Now, when working with foster youth, if they do not know what their social security number is, they can contact their county child welfare department or their local independent living program. For homeless students, they should speak with their high school counselor. And for students without a social security number, they should complete the California Dream Act application instead of the FAFSA application. Now, students will have to list at least one college for their FAFSA or CADA in order to submit, but they can list up to 20 different colleges. So where a student plans to attend can change, and students can return to their application at any point to add or update college choices even after they submit their application. Students will need that FSA ID login information to access and complete their FAFSA application. Now, this only applies to FAFSA applicants only. Their SSID number, which is a unique number assigned to each student in California's public K through 12 system. It is recommended but not required for CADA applicants to include their SSID number when completing the application. And then you may have some students that are undocumented immigrants that may have an ITIN number, and this ITIN number is used to file federal income tax returns, but this field is optional and may not apply if the individual did not earn enough income to be required to file taxes. And then students should be prepared to record current assets. So this can include cash, checking, and savings account balances. In most cases, though, students do not need to have a copy of their tax return on hand. There are very limited scenarios where this may be required, which we'll be covering in the next few slides. So now we dive into the FAFSA application itself. So the application uses income information from the prior year. So for example, when applying for the 26-27 school year, income data will be based on earnings from 2024. Now this information is imported through a new process called Federal Tax Information, or FTI, which replaces the old IRS data retrieval tool, or the DTR. Now, student consent is required to access and import their federal tax information. This consent must be given even if the student did not file a tax return. And then students who did not file taxes are no longer required to obtain a verification of non-filing letter from the IRS, which is great news for our students because this reduces any unnecessary barriers for them completing their applications. Now, a copy of the tax return is only needed if the student received scholarships during that tax year. So in this case, that would have been 2024 that they reported on their FAFSA. And if a student's income or circumstances have changed since 2024, they should contact their financial aid office to request an income adjustment to better reflect their current situation. Now, when completing the FAFSA for the 26-27 school year, students will be asked, what will your college grade level be when you begin the 26-27 school year? So for first-time students, they would click that first-year freshman. This applies even if the student has earned college credits through dual enrollment in high school. Dual enrollment does not change their grade level for FAFSA purposes. Now, for returning students, grade level is based on the number of credits or units completed toward their degree or certificate, not the number of years they have been in college. So, for example, if degree completion requires 60 units, a student entering their second year who had not yet completed 30 units would select first year freshmen, even though they are on their second year of being in school. And some other examples, so you could have a full-time student taking 15 units per semester. They might reach their second year status only after 1 year. And then you may have a part-time student, however, they might take 2 or more years to reach that same level. Your grade level should reflect your academic progress, not the time spent enrolled. Now, students who are then asked a series of questions to determine if they are an independent or dependent student. Now, this determination guides whether a student needs to provide income information from their parents, which can significantly impact how much financial aid they qualify for. Now, it's important to note that this dependency status for the FAFSA or CADAA application is different from dependency status on a person's tax return. Students are asked about all of the qualifying factors for an independent status on a single screen, except for their homelessness status, but we will get to more of that in a minute. But they should check all that apply on this one-page screen. Then there are three options that may be particularly relevant to our youth that have experience in the foster care system. So one question asks if the student was a ward of court at any time during turning 13, and then another asks if the student was in foster care anytime after turning 13. So the U.S. Department of Education has not provided guidance yet on the distinction between being in foster care and being a ward of the court. So students may select either or both if they feel this is applicable. Now, to qualify, a student must have been declared a dependent by the court and lived in an out-of-home placement at any point on or after their 13th birthday. So students can select this option even if they were in foster care for only 1 day after the age of 13. Now, while this includes foster youth under the jurisdiction of the probation system, it's important to note that incarcerated youth are not considered wards of the court for FAFSA purposes, nor are youth who were on probation but never resided in an out of home placement. And then for legal guardianship, so the student must have had a legal guardianship in place either currently or at the time they turned 18. Both kinship guardianships and non relative legal guardianships do qualify for this section. Now, financial aid offices in California can often automatically verify a student's foster youth status through a data match with the California Department of Social Services or CDSS. And this populates a screen in the WebGrants system. Now, this process is intended to streamline that verification and reduce the barriers that are placed onto students. Now, unfortunately, the CDSS data match does not always work. So, for example, due to any data mismatches or incomplete records, if the automatic verification fails, the financial aid office may request documentation, such as a letter from the County Child Welfare Agency or another official source. And then once a student's foster youth status has been successfully verified, it does not need to be re-verified in future years as long as the student remains at the same institution. Now, this really helps reduce that redundancy and simplifies the financial aid process for continuing students. So, if a student is currently in foster care and needs help verifying their status for financial aid, what they can do is contact their social worker or their local independent living program coordinator. They can provide documentation or connect them to appropriate resources. Now, for former foster youth, if the student is no longer in care but needs assistance in confirming their foster youth status, they can contact the Office of the California Foster Care Ombudsman for help. We have their phone number and their website listed on this slide for those folks. And then foster youth verification may be required for other benefits and programs. So having this verification available is really critical for these students. And we recommend that you help students get this verification before they leave high school and work with them to store that verification in a safe location online. Now, when verifying a student's status as foster youth or ward of court, financial aid administrators are required to accept a variety of different documentation types. And this flexibility really helps ensure that students don't face unnecessary barriers to aid. So, we have a long list of different acceptable forms of verification, and this can include a court order or an official state document showing that the student received federal or state support in foster care. We've also got verification of eligibility for a Chafee grant. So this alone can confirm foster care status. Additionally, verification may come from a phone call or a written statement from a state, county, or tribal agency administering a program under the Title 4B or 4E of the Social Security Act. So this could be a child welfare or probation agency. And then there's also a public or private foster care placing agency or a foster care facility placement, such as a foster home agency, a transitional housing provider for non minor dependents, or an STRTP or a group home. And then also a state Medicaid agency. And then additionally, an attorney or a court appointed special advocate, so a CASA advocate that's familiar with the student's case, and then also a financial aid administrator who possibly previously documented the student's circumstances in the same or prior award year. The goal here is really to remove barriers to ensure that eligible students can access aid without needing to provide redundant or burdensome paperwork. So now that we've covered foster care and ward of court status, the next question that's asked is whether the student has experienced homelessness or is at risk of homelessness. Now, it's important to note that these students may not always identify themselves as homeless, so counselors and financial aid staff play a really key role in asking supportive questions to determine if the student may qualify as homeless and helping students get that documentation they need. So let's talk about what these terms mean. So students must be unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless to qualify. So, unaccompanied means that the student is not living with a parent or guardian. A student who is homeless and living with a parent is not considered independent for the FAFSA and CADAA and therefore must provide their parents' income information. Now, homeless means is that the student lacks fixed, regular, and adequate housing, and we'll talk more about this in the next slide. Self-supporting means the student is providing for their own living expenses. So this can include food, rent, and transportation without consistent financial support from a parent or guardian. And then at risk of being homeless refers to situations where the student's living arrangement may soon end or is unstable. So for example, if they are staying somewhere temporarily and don't know where they'll go next, or if they are being evicted. So let's dive into a little bit more about these definitions of homeless and what it means to lack fixed, regular, and adequate housing. So a fixed resident is one that is permanent and not subject to frequent change. So for example, living in a friend's spare bedroom temporarily or in a motel for a few weeks would not be considered fixed. Then when we get to a regular residence is one where a person can return to sleep each night. For example, alternating between relatives' homes or sleeping in different places each week is not regular. And then adequate means the living situation meets basic physical and safety needs, for example, to ensure that they have heat, electricity, water, space, and privacy. So, as an example, a garage, a car, an overcrowded apartment that does not meet health or safety standards and is not adequate. Now, note that this definition does include a more broader set of circumstances than the definition of homeless that is used for many government housing programs. So some other examples that you may see is students may have to leave their situations or their housing placement temporarily due to their losing of housing or economic hardship or another similar reason. And this can look like couch surfing between either relatives, friends. They may be staying in motels, hotels, or trailer parks because they don't have anywhere else to stay, or they might be staying in emergency shelter. Or you may come across students that are living in their cars, they're sleeping outside, or staying someplace that normally is not meant for human habitation. And as a reminder, these students may not always identify themselves as homeless. Because many students who qualify do not self identify as homeless, it is often more effective to ask questions that reveal their housing situation rather than directly asking if the student is homeless. So, when interviewing a student to determine housing status, it is important to approach the conversation with sensitivity. These students should not be asked to explain or justify their circumstances, but simply to establish whether or not they meet the definition of homelessness. And we've provided some examples that you can ask the students that you're working with. So, some of these questions: can you tell me about where you're staying right now? Do you stay in the same place every night? Could your friend, relative that you are currently staying with ask you to leave if they wanted to? Where would you go if they had asked you to leave? Do you feel like this place you're staying is temporary or more long term? Do you have to move around from place to place, sometimes referred to as couch surfing because you lost your housing or can't afford your own place to live? So these are just some really great questions that doesn't put the student on the spot and can really open up that flow of communication for your students. Now, if a student answers yes to the question about homeless status, they will be asked if they have verification for from any of the listed entities, which includes programs serving people experiencing homelessness, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Liaison from the student's K through 12 school district, a TRIO, a Gear Up program, or a financial aid administrator from another institution. Now, there are now many options for verification than before the FAFSA update took place 2 years ago, which is great news for our students. Now, FFAs must accept documentation, including a documented phone call from these entities, unless there is documented conflicting information. The student does not need to redetermine every year if the student is at the same institution unless the student informs the institution that circumstances have changed or the institution has specific conflicting information about the student's independence and has informed the student of this information. And they must make it as quickly as feasible. And whenever possible, students should get a determination from one of these sources rather than rely on having the FFA make that determination. That is something you can do with students on now. And financial aid administrators' determination of homelessness must be made without regard to the reasons why the student is unaccompanied and or homeless. And if the student doesn't have this verification, they should select none of these apply. And if none of these apply, students can still continue to complete their FAFSA as an independent student, but they must contact their financial aid office to get verified. So FFAs must make a determination for youth who cannot get determinations from another authority based on a written statement or a documented interview with the students. The determination must be made based on the legal definitions of homeless and unaccompanied contained in the education subtitle of the McKinney-Vento Act and independently from the reasons that the student is an unaccompanied homeless youth or is a youth who is unaccompanied at risk of homelessness and self-supporting. Now, students may also complete the FAFSA as a provisional independent student if they believe they may qualify for independent status due to unusual situations such as parental abandonment, abuse, neglect, legally granted asylum, or a student or parental incarceration. Now, it's important to note that this provisional status is different from homeless status. So, financial aid administrators must make determinations for unaccompanied homeless youth following the process outlined in the law. It is not a matter of their professional judgment. FAAs have more flexibility, however, when evaluating unusual circumstances. Provisional independence may be helpful for youth who are neither homeless nor foster youth, but who nonetheless have extenuating circumstances that preclude being able to obtain parental information. So next, students are then asked a series of demographic questions and are asked to provide information about their high school completion status. Students are also asked about their citizenship status. If they are not a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, they should be completing the CADAA application and not the FAFSA application. So students may select prefer not to answer to the questions about race and ethnicity and parents' education status, and it does not impact eligibility for aid. So on the FAFSA application, students must respond either male or female to the question regarding sex. Now, for students whose gender identity is different than their sex at birth, you can explain to them that this is a question just for research purposes only, and they can answer however they wish, and it will not impact their eligibility for aid. And if completing the CADA application, students are asked about their gender identity rather than sex. So keep in mind that for some students, this may not be information they feel safe to share, or it may not be information that they have yet shared with any adult supporter. So given the sensitive nature of these questions, we do recommend using this as an opportunity to proactively let students know that this is a safe space and you are affirming that the student's identity. So you might want to say things like, this is a safe space, I am an LGBTQ ally, or I want you to know I'm supportive of all gender identities and expressions. Doing this may also help to strengthen the relationship and create opportunities for future conversations. Now, if a student is an eligible non-citizen, they will be asked to enter their alien registration number. Now, when a student is asked about their high school completion status, they can indicate that they have received or will receive a diploma, have a diploma equivalent like a GED, or if they are homeschooled. Now, if the student completing or will complete high school, make sure that they use the search function to find their high school and ensure it is entered correctly. And when asked about their high school completion status, students who select that they are homeschooled or received a high school equivalent certificate like a GED are also eligible for aid. So let's review some of the financial sections. So it will start with a question about if the student has received any federal benefits such as free and reduced price school lunch, Medicaid, SNAP benefits, or SSI. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the federal names of these benefits are different than the names used locally in California, and students may not be aware of this. So, for example, Medicaid is the federal name for Medi-Cal. SNAP is the federal name for CalFresh, and TANF is the federal name for CalWorks. So it notes that their responses do not affect their eligibility for federal student aid. However, there are benefits to disclosing this information, and students should be encouraged to check all the boxes that apply to them. Doing this may make the student exempt from reporting current assets. Now, while income information is automatically imported from the IRS, the FAFSA does have a question about four special types of income. There are three that are extremely unlikely to be relevant, but one of them does ask about the amount of college grants, scholarships, and AmeriCorps benefits reported as income to the IRS. So if the student had had any of these sources of income in 2024, and included them in their 2024 tax return, it is important that they report on the FAFSA, even though the form shows this as optional. Then these are now the only questions a student is asked about their assets. So if it's not listed on this slide, it does not need to be reported. So one question is about the current total of cash, savings, and checking accounts. So financial aid received, such as grants or scholarships, does not need to be reported. So for example, if you're working with a student that just received their aid disbursement for the spring and therefore has $10,000 sitting in their bank account, this number should not be included in their asset total. And some students may be exempted from providing asset information, in which case this screen will not appear. And they are also asked about current net worth of investments. So this can include real estate, business, or investment farms. Assets do not include the value of a car or a computer. So as mentioned before, students can select up to 20 colleges to have their FAFSA sent to. So after the application is processed, which I'll talk about in just a minute in the next slide, and if necessary, they can update their application by removing the colleges listed and adding up to an additional 20 new colleges. And they can repeat this process as many times as necessary. The original colleges will still receive the information. And students are no longer asked about their housing plans. However, the housing plan, so whether this is off campus, on campus, or with parents, does impact the calculation of cost of attendance and therefore how much aid a student is eligible for. So colleges must determine housing status from their own records, such as who paid a housing deposit. Many colleges with on-campus housing are providing an initial financial aid award offer based on the assumption of living on campus, with the caveat that the aid offer may change if the student doesn't live on campus. Now, if the college is non-residential, like many community colleges, they are usually basing the aid offer on living off campus, which is the highest cost option. So some colleges are including a question on their admission application. So CSUs are doing this currently, or sending out a questionnaire after the student accepts the offer of admission. So now, once a student completes their application, they would receive a confirmation page with their estimated student aid index, or SAI. This SAI is used to determine eligibility for federal student aid. It is not how much aid that the student is eligible to receive. And typically, students receiving a FAFSA submission summary, and it would indicate that their FAFSA was processed within 1 to 3 days. Now, one last caveat. So AB 540 exempts certain students from paying non-resident tuition, which is higher than resident tuition, and or it allows them to apply for and receive state aid at eligible California public and private colleges. So for students submitting a CADA application, an AB 540 affidavit must be submitted that verifies the student meets that AB 540 criteria, which includes attending California schools for at least 3 years and being on track to obtain high school graduation, whether this is a diploma or an alternative, or if they are attending a community college, be on track to obtain an associate's degree or a transfer to a CSU or UC system. The AB 540 affidavit is embedded directly into the CADA application. So the application will ask students to provide information about where they attended school, the dates they attended, and the units they completed. So they'll want to have their transcript information handy. Now, some key points: students are no longer required to file a separate AB 540 affidavit. Each college is responsible for verifying eligibility and may request transcripts or other documentations to confirm. And then there is one exception. So the University of California, the UC system, does not accept the embedded affidavits. So students may need to submit an additional form.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cody. Now that we've talked about completing the applications, your job is actually not yet done. So there are steps that still need to be taken after the FAFSA or CADA has been completed. Okay, so first, looking at Chafee, right? First, current and former foster youth should apply for a Chafee grant. So a current this mu- so to qualify, someone must be a current or former foster youth who is a dependent or ward of the court or living in an out of home foster care placement at least one day between the ages of 16 to 18. And they may receive up to 4,500 for up to 5 years, whether or not consecutive until the age 26. So I know as mentioned earlier, it was 5,000, and this year it's gone down to 4,500, but still wanting to lift that up. It can be used at public or private colleges, and this can be also universities or career and technical schools in California, but can also be out of state as well. And a person must be enrolled at least half-time. So a separate application is required for first-time applicants in addition to the FAFSA CADA. So remember, this is separate from the FAFSA CADA. And you can go to the Chafee website to apply. And we really recommend to apply as soon as possible. The application is available now, and it can be done before the student completes their FAFSA or CADA. The planned school of attendance refers to one college the student plans to attend. And if the student doesn't know yet where they will be going, they can select one and then update it later and then WebGrants. And we're going to talk about that further on the next slide. And if the student does not see their school listed, they should call CSAC. This will be particularly true for students attending a college or university out of state, as most out of state campuses are not listed on the application. However, the Chafee grant, as a reminder, can still be used at state institutions that are eligible, out of state institutions that are eligible. And students can also update their Chafee grant applications and then monitor to the award status on the web grants for students. And then lastly, depending on the availability of funding, students may be waitlisted. If they are waitlisted, they do not need to reapply, so you can visit the Chafee website to see the prioritization system for students on the waitlist. Okay, so WebGrants is where students can actually see their Cal Grant and their Chafee status. And it's sort of like your financial aid dashboard. So logging in regularly can actually prevent a lot of last minute issues. So we highly encourage people to check it frequently. And the next step for all students is to create a WebGrants for Students account. So students should do this after their FAFSA or CADA has been processed, which for the FAFSA can take 1 to 2 weeks. CSAC does have a help available hotline for students who run into the issue setting up their account. Okay, so WebGrants to-dos for students. Once the account is set up for students, you should first check the award status and then amount for the Cal Grant, Middle Class Scholarship, and Chafee Grant. Next, you're going to want to verify if there are pending items or forms that still need to be completed. Next, you would also want to confirm that school of attendance is accurate. So this means the college that the student plans to attend. And so when the student submits their FAFSA or CADA, they may select multiple schools or that they may be intending to apply to. However, this step requires to confirm which school they actually choose to attend so that way they can receive their financial aid. You're going to want to also verify that their high school GPA has been received by CSAC for an eligibility determination for the Cal Grant. If not, the student should contact their high school counselor or CSAC. And for state financial aid programs such as the Cal Grant B and Student Success Completion Grant, a minimum high school GPA of 2.0 is required. And schools generally submit this GPA to CSAC. However, sometimes there can be an error in the data match. And so, for example, as we know, foster youth and homeless youth often experience a lot of school and housing mobility. So this can lead to mismatches in the data system between the address on file when the student submits their FAFSA and then the address on file when the school submits the GPA. So that discrepancy can really cause challenges. And it's critical to have students check in to see if their GPA has been submitted so that they don't miss out on thousands of dollars in state financial aid. You're also going to want to ensure to enter the high school graduation date. This will become available on the first day of the month of their planned graduation month. And if the student applied for Chafee Grant, check their Department of Social Services record. And you want to ensure that it's complete to verify their foster youth status. And this occurs through an automated data match. Please note, though, that being verified by social services triggers a number of additional aid sources for foster youth, including those in care after the age of 13. And so this can be the expanded Cal Grant, the expanded Student Success Completion Grant, and the expanded Middle Class Scholarship. So adult supporters should work with students to ensure that they have been properly verified. Okay, so this slide shows the possible award status cards within WebGrants. And so if an award status is pending, students should check their to-do list basically to determine the next steps. So if the award status is not awarded, just click on the reason, and then that will tell you more. And you can consult with a financial aid office or CSAC if you believe there is an error. And here is another example of a web grant screen for a student who submitted a Chafee grant application, but did not submit a FAFSA or CADAA. So in this example, the student's foster care verification has not been completed. And so keep in mind that foster care verification for Chafee only happens monthly and may therefore not appear immediately. And so you'll want to advise students that this may take time to reflect on web grants. And if the student feels that they should be eligible based on their time in foster care, but there is not a verification on file through the automatic data match, the student must click the link and then submit a manual verification form. Okay, so basically, financial aid isn't just about applying. You also have to keep making progress. So schools look at your GPA, how many classes you're completing, and then how long you've been enrolled. And so if you don't meet the GPA or course completion requirements for 2 terms, you will lose access to financial aid. So it's really important to understand SAP, satisfactory academic progress. And so this is really important to also review with students. Research has shown that 1 in 4 California's incoming community college Pell Grant recipients are likely not making SAP for their first 2 consecutive terms and disqualifying them from continued access to most forms of financial aid without a successful appeal. And the number really goes up too for subpopulations. So 34%, for example, of foster youth fail to make SAP in their first year. And students need to typically maintain a 2.0 GPA and not drop more than a third of the classes they enroll in. And if a student does become disqualified and drops out, they also won't be able to access aid if they return to college later, even if it's been actually many years. And so if a student does lose financial aid, colleges do have an appeal process, but navigating this process can be tricky, and it's much better if they never have to face SAP disqualification just to begin with. Okay. And so the goal here, right, is to help students stay eligible for aid before there's a problem. So it's crucial that students access upfront services, for advising to ensure they're enrolling in classes that they can be successful in and that they utilize any needed supports to help keep their grades up. And so a quick check-in with a counselor or an advisor can actually make the difference between keeping your aid or losing it. And we really want to shift from being reactive to being more proactive. So if students do understand how SAP works early on, they're less likely to face sudden holds or a lot of surprises later. And so a couple of ideas, right? First, you're going to want to inform. So inform students about how SAP works. You're going to want to connect students to an academic counselor to ensure they're registering for the proper classes. And then advise that students talk to a counselor before dropping or withdrawing from any classes. You also want to inform students about the appeal process if they fail to meet SAP. So just to state this, right? Life happens. A student may experience a hardship while in college. Sometimes folks experiencing homelessness. Sometimes there'll be like a death of a loved one. And so that may impact, your school performance. And so students should be educated that they can submit an appeal due to those, situations and the special circumstances to request that their financial aid be reinstated. And connecting students to resources early, again, being that proactive mindset and not reactive, it just really pays off. So, for example, if a student struggles with math, think about how to proactively connect them to tutoring. And if a student is going through a big life transition, discuss with the student what unit load would be the most realistic for them to successfully complete their other competing priorities. Okay, I feel like an infomercial now because I'm going to be like, but wait, there's more. So the last thing we want to really ensure folks know about is CalKIDS scholarships. All right. So California is unique and has a program called CalKIDS. And so this actually sets up an account for students when they are young that earns interest and is then available for them to help pay for college. And CalKIDS scholarships are profoundly important. And here's why. We know that from the research that these college savings accounts, also scholarships, as we're talking about with CalKIDS, have a really substantial impact both in college enrollment and in completion. And so children who have college savings accounts are 3 times more likely to enroll in college, but they're actually 5 times more likely to graduate. And so here's the big part. This study that you're seeing here with this information, this actual study was based on youth when they have as little as $500 in an account. And so it's important to not underestimate how kids scholarships can be life altering. And so what we know, right, is that psychologically, when someone has that money set aside for them, it's sending a message. And the message is, hey, you're college material. We believe in you. You got this. You can do this. And we're putting this investment aside for you. And so we really want to, again, highlight just, how important, CalKIDS is. So when we look here, though, there's 2 types of CalKIDS scholarships. So, really wanting to reflect at least a bit on those, right? There's the one on the left you can see here, which is for birth accounts. And so this is like an initial seed deposit. And then on the right, you can see the school age accounts. And so we're going to be talking a lot more about the one on the right today, those school age accounts. We want to talk about that there's a bit of nuance to CalKIDS. I had mentioned it earlier about the range, which is typical from 500 to 1,000. But these amounts here you can see can actually stack. So it can actually go to 1,500. And because of interest, I think we had worked with someone in LA County who reported receiving 1,600 in their CalKIDS scholarship. But to clarify, there's different tiers. So for one, there's 500 for students who are identified as low income. There's also 500 for students who are identified as foster youth, and this is under the local controlled funding formula. And then the third one is there's an additional 500 for homeless youth, and this is the broader definition of McKinney-Vento and at the more narrow definition of HUD. So we want to again highlight this and that these, again, to reiterate, can stack. A little bit about the history, though, of CalKIDS. When CalKIDS launched, accounts were created for all eligible low-income, homeless, and foster youth public school students in grades 1 through 12. And this was captured on Census Day of October 6, 2021, during the academic school year 2021 to 2022, which, as we know, a lot was going on because of the pandemic. And the following 2 school years, new CalKIDS accounts were created, but these were only for first graders identified as low income or homeless or foster youth on Census Day. The big change, though, and this is really important to keep in mind, is that starting in fall of 2025, AB 2508 broadened CalKIDS eligibility so that to repeat, all foster youth in grades 1 through 12 on Census Day 2024 will receive the supplemental payment if they haven't already. And so that is a change from just limiting it just to first graders. And this change is actually expected to benefit more than 12,000 students this year. And it's going to benefit 21,000 students over the next 3 years. So what we mean is that foster youth who did not previously receive that 500 payment for low income will also get that amount added to their accounts. So they'll have a total of 1,000. And this expansion is set to end on January 1st, 2029, unless, of course, there's additional funding which is provided. Okay, so claim your CalKIDS scholarships. A student can check in on the CalKIDS website to see if they have money in an account and then claim the money, which means they link themselves to their account and then can then request use of the money once they're enrolled in college. So funds can be used once a student is enrolled in an eligible college. So this can also include technical or vocational schools. And the scholarships, they can be claimed at any time. The important thing to know, though, is that they have to be used before the age of 26. So do know that there is an expiration for when you can use your CalKIDS scholarship. Okay, so what is needed to claim these scholarships? All right, so I know, and we've talked about this a lot at JBAY. We know that a lot of folks, when they think about this process, that there's this fear, it's this long, cumbersome process, like filing your taxes. But it's not. It actually only takes a couple of minutes. So we want to really hammer that one home. And you actually don't need a lot of information to go ahead and claim these. So you just need your, your statewide student ID. You also just need to know the date of birth and then the name of the county where the student was enrolled when the scholarship was created. Now, alternatively, a letter is mailed to students about their eligibility for a CalKIDS scholarship, and it actually has a very unique CalKIDS code. So students can actually use this to log into their account. And to just hammer the message home, it only takes a couple minutes. We also want to share some exciting news as well about CalKIDS, which is some of the updates that are going on. So starting just this month, literally just this month, all students who have a WebGrants for Students account and a matched CalKIDS scholarship in their name will actually see a new section for CalKIDS on the portal. And so in this example, the student has claimed their account and there's a link to log into their account. If an account is unclaimed, the green box will stay unclaimed, but there will be a link to go ahead to claim your CalKIDS account. And if the data we want to reiterate, it is updated monthly. So if a student claimed their scholarship, the status may not be updated on WebGrants immediately. So just kind of, provide a little bit of caution about that. And then data is also available for administrators. So on the back end, administrators can have this and they can see ages 14 on up. The last thing to kind of keep in mind is that this data is not yet on Win SEP. And for those who don't know, that's like a file secure transfer system that our partners with the FAFSA challenge use. So we're working on it, but we just wanted to give that heads up that it's not yet there. And then lastly, at JBAY, we're really excited about CalKIDS. We really see the potential for this, and we want to help get the word out there. So part of our goal, right, as we demonstrated, there's such an importance for this. We want to help people claim, and we really want to invite everyone part of the process to helping young folks claiming their CalKIDS scholarships. At one point, we were at 7.4% for foster youth back in June, and then it was at 6.3% for homeless youth. But as we can see here, it's actually at 10% as of July. But as you know, or as you can see, it's gone up, and our goal is to ultimately get to 50% for claiming their scholarship. But ideally, just to reiterate, we want to aim for the stars and ensure that as many youth as possible do get these.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. All right. So, as promised, I'm going to be sharing a long list of resources that we have for everyone. So, JBay offers financial aid guides that provide information for both foster and homeless students. And this includes resources for private scholarships and are completing by visual or complemented by visual guides and high school counselor toolkits to help students, families, and school staff navigate the financial aid process more effectively. And as of this morning, all of our materials have been updated and are available at those links at the bottom. So the visual guides take you through the FAFSA and CADAA applications. It's screen by screen with additional information and tips along the way to make the process as easy as possible for our foster and homeless youth. Then these are also guides that provide additional information about CalKIDS, including our marketing tools and a program information guide. And these links, as I mentioned, are all provided on the slide at the bottom. The marketing toolkit has flyers, social media images, and more that you can use to promote these resources. Then we've got some toolkits that are designed to help high school counselors, social workers, caregivers, and other supportive adults working with students in grades 6 through 12 who have experienced foster care and are preparing for post-secondary education. Now, these toolkits provide a step-by-step checklist, key resources, and important definitions to help counselors connect students with the critical financial aid opportunities. There are also student-facing materials that we have for those in ninth through 11th grade, and these guides are both available in English and Spanish. Then I also wanted to share some additional resources. So Schoolhouse Connection offers practical tools for identifying and supporting students experiencing homelessness. So on their FAFSA page, you'll find sample verification letters, screening tools, and flowcharts that make it easier to determine eligibility and guide students through the process. We then have National Center for Homeless Education, or NCHE. They provide federal guidance and resources to help students experiencing homelessness navigate higher education. And this can include FAQs, training materials, and links to important federal updates. Then we've got iCanGoToCollege.com. This is a statewide California site that offers step-by-step guidance on college planning and financial aid. So it's a great resource to share with students and families who are just getting started with the college going process. Then we have financial aid for justice involved youth. So this is through the Youth Law Center, and they developed this resource to support justice involved youth in accessing financial aid and pursuing education after involvement in the juvenile system. Then we've got Immigrants Rising. So they are providing a wealth of information and tools for undocumented and immigrant students, including guides on financial aid scholarships and career pathways. And lastly, Advising California Undocumented Students and Mixed Status Families. So this guide offers practical advising strategies for counselors and educators working with undocumented students and mixed status families, helping ensure that students are receiving accurate and compassionate supports. And then I also wanted to just take a moment to highlight a couple of supports available for those working directly with students in foster care or experiencing homelessness. So I will be continuing to provide support directly to our foster youth service coordinating programs, or FYSCPs, that are participating in our foster youth FAFSA challenge. And this will include helping with strategies to engage students, answering data related questions, and troubleshooting any barriers that may come up along the way. And then in addition, we want to inform everyone about the homeless education drop-in hours. So these sessions are open to anyone supporting students experiencing homelessness, whether you are an FYSCP, a counselor liaison, or community partner. It's more of an informal space where you can bring questions to us, share what's working in your region, and connect with your peers who are facing similar challenges. So, our next session is coming up Thursday, November 6th at 10 a.m., and the registration link is there. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us if you are interested in those drop in hours. And then lastly, a FAFSA prototype is available as well if you want to pre-use the FAFSA without creating an actual FAFSA application. It's important to note that sometimes a prototype does not align exactly with all of the FAFSA questions, but it is still a great tool. So if you have a student that wants to kind of play around with the questions and get a look at the application prior to creating the account, or if you yourself want to get more familiar with the questions and better provide support for yourself to help your student, this is going to be an absolute wonderful resource for you. And with that, we will go ahead and open it up for some questions. I know the chat's been going off the rails, which is great to see. So I'll hand it over to Jessica to highlight any common questions or important questions that have come up.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cody and Chris, for all this great information. And thank you to all of our attendees for being here today and all of your great questions. There were definitely some common questions that came up and some pending questions that I wanted to take a moment to respond to. So first, we will be again sending all of these materials, the recording and the slides to everyone registered in today's webinar. It will also be posted on our website along with all of our other financial aid materials. We will also be summarizing all the questions in the Q&A from today and sending that up as a follow-up as well. So let's talk about CalKIDS. I know there was a few questions that came up in the chat, so just wanted to clarify a few details. CalKIDS is available for both students who are U.S. citizens as well as undocumented students. So that program's offered for both populations. There was a question about, is there a deadline to apply? There is not a deadline. The funds can be claimed and requested for distribution at any time before the age of 26. However, we encourage you to have students claim those accounts as soon as possible so they can start seeing that money and knowing that it's there and starting to plant that seed. But there is not a deadline other than that age of 26. There was quite a few questions, just again, a little confusion around who's eligible, who's getting these accounts. So I just wanted to reiterate how the rollout of this has gone, because I know many of you are in the chat how are working with older students, non-minor dependents, those in college. So the program for our low-income students first rolled out in 21-22. So it's still a very new program. And in that initial year, it was just for those who are identified in foster care in first through 12th grade on Census Day in October 2021. So if you've got any older students, the question would be, were they in foster care on that Census Day in those grades in October 2021? If so, they might have an account. And if they weren't in foster care, they may have been homeless or they may have been low income. So it's still worth having them log in and check to see if there's some money there that they can claim. The following 2 years, it was only for those identified as low-income, foster, or homeless in first grade. And then due to the expansion that Chris was talking about, just to reiterate, those students who were identified in first through 12th grade last October 2024 would have those accounts created for them. And anyone who had an account that was in foster care that did not have that low income payment and should have, will automatically get that money added to their account. So if you're working with any students who maybe only had $500 in there in the past for being in foster care, I would just takes a few minutes. I would just encourage them, go in, log in. They might be getting an additional $500 payment for being low income. And that expansion, those accounts are being created and will be launching very soon, probably in the next month or so. So, if it's not there, keep on checking with your students. Those will definitely be there by the end of the year. And can anyone help with youth with accessing these accounts? Yes, there's no guidance. Anyone can work with them to assist them in logging in, helping them figure out their SSID, figuring out all those details. So if you're working with a young person, please, yes, take that opportunity to assist them. And I know there was some confusion about, well, what is the intersection with CalKIDS and WebGrants? So if they have not yet claimed their account, there's two options. You either go to the CalKIDS website, directly log in to claim, or when they're in that WebGrants for Students portal, if they have an account created, it's going to show that it's unclaimed. They can then click on the link and that will take them to CalKIDS. So there's two routes to get there essentially, either directly through the CalKIDS website or by going in for WebGrants for Students to then get to the account and log in. All right, so I think that may have clarified all our CalKIDS questions. Another question that we had was around the Chafee grant. So just to clarify for the Chafee grant, both students who meet eligibility for the California Dream Act application or the FAFSA are eligible to apply. They have to be in foster care at least one day between the ages of 16 and 18, and they only have to be part-time. So they have to be enrolled in at least 6 units. They do not have to be a full-time student. Another common question we had, and I'll hand this over to you, Jillian, if yeah, still there, hopefully. One of the questions was, what about if a student is a foster youth? They've also been homeless. They're filling out the FAFSA in the independent student section. What would you advise? How do they respond to that? Is there any advantage to clicking both? Should they click both, if they meet both criteria?
Thanks, Jessica. We get this question a lot because we know there's a lot of overlap between our two populations. Definitely you can click all that apply. So in those first student circumstances, if a student is a former foster care student, they can click that. But if they're also experiencing homelessness and unaccompanied, or unaccompanied and at risk of homelessness and self-supporting, they can click those answers as well. The only benefit is that there might be certain resources and support at specific institutions that might be eligible for students experiencing homelessness and not eligible for students in foster care or vice versa. So it's just widening the range of various resources that these students might be eligible for. But they can, regardless, they'll be an independent student for either foster care or homelessness. It's just clicking more things to be eligible for possibly more resources. One thing to note is that I know that sometimes there's confusion of, if I'm checking all these things, do I need to provide verification or, determinations for foster care status and the homelessness status? And you don't. You just need to be determined by one of those things. So no need to have to provide, all this extra documentation just because you might be able to click all those extra boxes.
Thank you. So another thing I wanted to add that we didn't mention in our presentation, and I appreciate someone brought up into the chat regarding students that are completing the CADAA and the AB 540 affidavit. We are aware that some universities are also requiring students to submit that affidavit in addition to, and so just to be aware if you're working with any of those students that they might have to fill out that form if required by their university as well. The other thing I wanted to note, there's been a lot of questions about different eligibility for different types of financial aid, and I know we only covered the CHAFE in today's presentation, but there's all these other financial aid programs that students might be eligible for if based on their experience as either being low income or foster care. And when you go to our financial aid guide, we have a great overview of all the common types of financial aid, how to apply, eligibility. And so if you go there, you can get more information to learn about the different types of programs. So as you're advising students to, to fill out the FAFSA and the CADAA, you can be educated to let them know what types of grants and financial aid they might be eligible for. And again, and how that can really add up depending on their eligibility, unit load, and things like that. The other thing to clarify, we got a lot of questions about this, is just kind of reiterating eligibility for independent status on the FAFSA and CADAA for foster care. So again, if someone was in foster care, but their case closed before the age of 13, they would not be eligible. However, if their case was opened before the age of 13 and continued beyond age 13, they only have to have been a dependent or ward of the court at least one day on or after their 13th birthday. This also applies to foster youth served by probation. Now, if someone is just never touched foster care, they are incarcerated as a ward of the court, they would not be eligible. However, if they're an eligible foster youth being served by probation and placed in out-of-home care placement, like an STRTP or even a resource family, those students would also qualify for independent status if it was at least one day on or after their 13th birthday. So just wanted to re-clarify that. And also when you go to let's see. Oh, another question about the guides. Hi, Jill. The link that we're providing has all of those guides in there. You can download them for free. There's also a link. We'll be updating it shortly in the next day. If someone wants to self-print, there's a few different options. If you want to pay to get a hard copy printed, or if you're doing a bulk order, we'll have files in there as well. So you can get the financial aid guides printed in bulk if you're interested in printing and ordering those for yourselves. We'll be providing free copies to all of our County Office of Ed and their foster youth services coordinating programs based on the numbers they've requested with us as well. And I think lastly, the only last thing I wanted to share that was a question that came up was around SAP standards. We didn't go into detail about this, but did want to emphasize that for the Chafee grant in California, this is just a California law, we have more flexible SAP standards for foster youth that are receiving the Chafee grant that are much more flexible and supportive of students than the SAP standards for all other types of financial aid. And we have a great resource. This was all due to the passage of a bill called SB 150, and I will put it into the chat for folks, although apparently multitasking is challenging. There we go. And you can learn more about it, but there's more flexibility with the Chafee grant, a whole separate appeals process, more flexibility to maintain their aid for additional terms. And if they lose aid due to SAP and they take a year break, they can come back and get the Chafee grant reinstated. So there's sample forms and templates in there too. And again, and a great resource to know if they might lose financial aid for other forms of financial programs for foster youth, they might have a lot more opportunity to maintain at least the Chafee grant. So with that, I think we've covered all of the questions. Again, we'll follow up with all of these materials. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here today and all the work you're doing to support students. It really makes a difference for them and getting this money and being able to pursue their post-secondary education. So thank you again, and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Jessica.